Lady Ashworth led Miss Marple through the French doors into the cool interior of Thornfield Manor, away from the lingering warmth of the garden. The drawing-room was dim after the bright afternoon, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the western sun. A maid was clearing away some scattered teacups, and Lady Ashworth dismissed her with a polite nod before closing the door firmly behind them. "I hardly know where to begin," Lady Ashworth said, sinking into the damask armchair near the fireplace. She was a woman of 60, still handsome in the austere manner of those born to privilege, but today her usual composure showed distinct signs of fracturing. "You see, Miss Marple, Charlotte has been, well, she's been acting most peculiarly for several weeks now. At first I attributed it to the natural nerves of a young woman approaching marriage, but this business today has made me genuinely concerned." Miss Marple settled herself in the adjacent chair with the careful deliberation of age. "What business would that be, Lady Ashworth?" "Her gloves," Lady Ashworth said, and then paused, as if uncertain how to continue. "I know it sounds ridiculous when I say it aloud, but Charlotte has been wearing gloves constantly for the past month, even indoors, even in her room. She's worn them to bed, if you can imagine such a thing. And when I've attempted to ask her about it, she becomes quite evasive, almost angry. This isn't like her at all. Charlotte has always been a straightforward girl, perhaps too candid at times, but lately there's something almost secretive in her manner. Has she sustained an injury to her hands?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, merely curious, though her mind was already cataloguing possibilities like a meticulous archivist. "Not that I've seen. I tried to examine them myself a week ago, but she absolutely refused. Pulled away from me most sharply. And then this afternoon, with that dreadful Merrick boy turning up uninvited. Well, not entirely uninvited. I did have the courtesy to include him on the list, as his father has done some legal work for us, but he certainly wasn't expected to show his face given the circumstances. Well, when he spoke to her, I thought Charlotte might actually faint. Her entire face went white." Miss Marple considered this. "What circumstances would those be?" Lady Ashworth glanced toward the door, as if to ensure they were completely alone. "I shouldn't speak of it, perhaps. But you're discreet, Miss Marple, and I confess I'm quite worried. Thomas Merrick was once engaged to Charlotte. This was 2 years ago, before she became engaged to Charles Devereux. The Merrick engagement was broken off rather suddenly, and there were some complications. Nothing improper, you understand, but Thomas took it very badly. He's been rather persistent in his attentions since, which has been embarrassing for everyone concerned." "And what did Mr. Merrick say to your daughter this afternoon?" "I have no idea," Lady Ashworth admitted. "They spoke only briefly, and I could not hear them, but afterward Charlotte excused herself and went directly to her room. She's been there ever since, claiming a headache. I've had tea sent up twice, and both trays have been returned untouched." Miss Marple rose with unhurried grace and moved to the window, where she could see the garden below, now nearly empty save for the servants clearing away the remnants of the party. The croquet mallets lay abandoned on the grass, the white furniture gleaming in the fading light. She observed all of this with the appearance of mere idle contemplation, though her mind was working with considerable rapidity. "I believe," Miss Marple said presently, "that we might require more information before drawing any conclusions. Perhaps I might impose upon your hospitality long enough to have a brief conversation with your daughter. Sometimes a neutral party, an elderly woman whom she's known for many years, can encourage confidences that a concerned mother cannot." Relief flooded across Lady Ashworth's features. "Would you? I should be enormously grateful. I confess I'm quite at my wit's end. Charlotte has always been such a good girl, so level-headed. But this secretiveness is making me fear that something dreadful has happened to her, or that she's gotten herself into some sort of trouble." They made their way upstairs to the first-floor landing, where a corridor lined with family portraits stretched toward the back of the house. Lady Ashworth knocked softly on the third door, which was opened after a considerable pause by Charlotte herself. She was still wearing the ivory gloves, Miss Marple noted, even though they were now visibly soiled at the cuffs. Charlotte's eyes widened with surprise at seeing Miss Marple, and for just a moment, no more than a fraction of a second, something that might have been fear flickered across her features before she mastered her expression. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "How unexpected. Please do come in." As Lady Ashworth discreetly excused herself and withdrew, Miss Marple entered the room, observing with her customary attention to detail the wrinkled bedspread, the untouched tea, and most significantly, the way Charlotte immediately moved to conceal her hands within the folds of her skirt. There was something almost hunted in the younger woman's posture now, something that spoke of genuine distress rather than mere social awkwardness. "My dear," Miss Marple said, settling herself on the small chair near the window, "your mother is quite concerned about you. I wonder if you might tell me what's troubling you." Charlotte's jaw tightened. She looked away toward the garden where the last rays of sunlight were beginning to fade into purple twilight. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Miss Marple, if I tell you something, will you promise to believe me, even if it sounds quite impossible?" Miss Marple smiled with the gentle reassurance that had encouraged countless confidences over the decades. "My dear, I have lived a very long time, and I have learned that the most impossible things are often the simplest truths, merely obscured by fear or shame. I should very much like to hear what troubles you." Charlotte remained silent for a long moment, her gloved hands twisting together in her lap. Outside, the evening chorus of birds began their sunset song, and somewhere in the distance, a servant closed a window against the cooling air. Finally, with what appeared to be a monumental effort, Charlotte rose and moved to her dressing table. She pulled open the bottom drawer and withdrew a small wooden box, the sort one might use to store jewelry or keepsakes. 3 weeks ago," Charlotte began, her voice trembling slightly, "I found this in the library. It was tucked behind the loose brick in the fireplace. You know the one, where we used to hide our childish treasures as girls. I was looking for a book and my hand brushed against something. At first I thought it might be something Father had left there years ago, something sentimental. Instead I found this." She opened the box and Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Inside lay a collection of letters, perhaps a dozen in total, tied together with a faded ribbon. The envelopes bore no postmarks, suggesting they had never been sent through the postal service. Charlotte extracted one and handed it to Miss Marple with visible reluctance. The letter was written in a bold, masculine hand, and as Miss Marple unfolded it, her eyes took in the contents with their characteristic thoroughness. What she read caused her eyebrows to rise fractionally, the only outward sign of her surprise. "Good heavens," she murmured. "This is from Thomas Merrick, is it not?" "Yes," Charlotte confirmed. "But they're not addressed to me. They're addressed to someone else entirely. Someone I didn't even know Father was acquainted with. And the things he writes about, Miss Marple, they're dreadful. Accusations of theft, threats of exposure, mentions of money that was supposed to be paid but wasn't. One of the letters mentions a sum of £300. Miss Marple carefully replaced the letter in its envelope and regarded Charlotte with penetrating interest. "Why, my dear, did you not show these to your father immediately?" "Because," Charlotte said quietly, "I found them the morning after Father collapsed. He's been ill these past 3 weeks, you see, though Mother has tried to keep it from becoming general knowledge. The doctor says his heart is weak, that he must avoid all stress and excitement. When I discovered these letters, I thought that if I showed them to him, if I involved him in whatever this business with Thomas Merrick is about, it might cause him genuine harm. And so you decided to conceal them?" "I decided to protect him," Charlotte corrected with a flash of spirit. "I've been trying to determine what these letters mean, whether they're genuine threats or merely the ravings of a disappointed man. Thomas was always rather intense, always prone to dramatic declarations. But when he arrived today and saw me, I could see in his face that he knew something. He said he needed to speak with me about the matter, and when I refused, he said that if I didn't help him, he would speak to Father directly. Help him how? Miss Marple's question was asked with perfect calm, but Charlotte hesitated before answering. He wanted me to tell him where Father keeps his money. He said it was owed to him, that my father had made promises that were never kept. I told him I knew nothing of such arrangements, that he was being absurd, but he didn't believe me. He said if I didn't cooperate, he would go to the police with the letters, claiming that Father had defrauded him. Miss Marple's mind was now working with considerable speed, examining the pieces of this puzzle with the precision of someone long accustomed to uncovering uncomfortable truths. Yet there was something about Charlotte's story that didn't quite sit properly, some element that remained opaque to her considerable understanding. "Charlotte," she said slowly, "I notice you're still wearing your gloves. You've worn them constantly for a month, you say, which would be approximately 3 weeks after you discovered these letters, and shortly after your father's collapse. I wonder if there might be some connection between your deliberate concealment of your hands and whatever difficulty this situation has presented you." Charlotte's face flushed deeply. She stood abruptly and moved away to the window, presenting her back to Miss Marple. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "The morning I found the letters," she said, "I went to see Thomas. I thought if I could speak to him reasonably, if I could understand what he truly wanted, perhaps I could resolve this quietly without troubling Father. We met in the copse near Blackwell Lane, where we used to meet when we were engaged. I thought I could reason with him, convince him that whatever claims he had were unfounded." "And did you?" "No," Charlotte whispered. "He became angry. He grabbed my wrists. He wanted me to swear that I would help him. We struggled and—" She trailed off, then slowly, with obvious reluctance, began to remove her right glove. Even in the dimming light, the bruises were perfectly visible. Dark purple marks in the distinct shape of fingers, circling her wrist in a pattern that spoke of considerable force. Similar marks, though somewhat faded, were visible on her left wrist as well. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her mind had suddenly reconfigured the entire situation. "My dear child," she said gently, "I believe you should tell me everything that happened that morning. Omit nothing, however shameful you fear it might seem." Charlotte sank back into the chair, her shoulders curved inward as though she might fold entirely into herself. The evening light had softened further, casting long shadows across the room, and Miss Marple reached over to switch on the small lamp beside the dressing table. The warm glow seemed to give Charlotte a measure of courage. "Thomas was waiting for me near the old stone bridge," Charlotte began, her voice taking on the quality of someone recounting a nightmare. "I'd sent him a note asking him to meet me, saying I needed to discuss the matter of the letters. He seemed almost pleased when I arrived, as though he believed I'd come to capitulate. I tried to explain that whatever my father may have promised him, it was based on a misunderstanding. That's when he became cold. He said I was lying, that I was protecting Father out of filial loyalty, but that he had proof, actual proof, that my father had taken money meant for investment and used it for his own purposes." "Did he show you this proof?" Miss Marple asked. "No, he said the proof existed, but that he wasn't fool enough to carry it on his person. He said it was somewhere safe, somewhere that would be discovered if anything happened to him. He was quite explicit about that particular point." Charlotte paused, swallowing with difficulty. "Then he demanded that I bring him £500 by the end of the week. He said it was payment for his silence, his discretion in the matter. When I refused, when I told him I simply couldn't do such a thing, he lost his temper entirely." Miss Marple observed the younger woman's face, noting the way her eyes had taken on a distant quality, as though she were viewing the events from some remove. It was a common response to trauma, she reflected, a protective mechanism the mind employed when confronted with its own powerlessness. "He grabbed my wrists," Charlotte continued. "He was quite rough about it. He said that if I didn't cooperate, he would make sure my father ended up in prison, that our entire family would be ruined. He said everyone in the village would know how we defrauded him, how father was nothing but a common thief. I tried to pull away, but he was so much stronger. I was genuinely afraid he might hurt me more seriously. What happened then? Miss Marple's voice remained calm and measured, betraying nothing of the wheels turning behind her thoughtful eyes. I screamed, Charlotte said simply. I don't know what else to do. And he released me immediately, as though the sound had startled him back to himself. For a moment, we simply stood there, both breathing heavily. Then he stepped back, and his expression changed. He looked almost frightened, actually, as though he'd suddenly realized what he'd done. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't meant to hurt me, that he was just desperate. He said his family was ruined, that his father had lost everything, and that if he didn't find a way to recover what he was owed, he would be cast out entirely. Charlotte fell silent, and Missy Marple allowed the quiet to persist for a long moment before asking her next question. And did you give him the money? No, Charlotte said firmly. But I told him I would try to speak with father, that I would see what might be arranged. I told him to give me a week, that it was the best I could do. He seemed to accept this. He apologized again, quite profusely actually, and said he would wait to hear from me. Then I came home and put on the gloves. I thought if I wore them constantly, no one would ask questions about the bruises. I thought if no one knew what had happened, then somehow it might not matter. But it did matter, Miss Marple observed gently. It mattered very much indeed. This afternoon, Charlotte continued, when Thomas appeared at the garden party, I was absolutely panic-stricken. I thought he had come to demand the money, to create a scene in front of everyone. Instead, he wanted to speak to me privately, and when we did, he seemed almost apologetic. He said he'd made a mistake, that he'd been acting out of desperation and fear, that he wanted to apologize properly. He said he'd decided to leave the village, that he was going to London tomorrow to try to find work, and that he wanted to resolve matters between us before he went. What did he propose as a resolution? He said he would destroy the letters. He said that if I would simply agree to forgive him, to keep what had happened between us private, he would pretend the entire affair had never occurred. He said he no longer cared about the money, that he just wanted to start fresh somewhere else. I told him I would think about it, that I needed time. And then he left, and I came inside and remained in my room. Miss Marple rose gracefully and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening garden. The last vestiges of daylight were fading now, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening purple of the sky. When she turned back to face Charlotte, her expression was both compassionate and grave. "My dear," she said quietly, "I must ask you something, and I must ask it with complete honesty. When Thomas left the garden party, where exactly did he go? Did anyone see him leave?" "I don't know," Charlotte admitted. "I wasn't watching. Why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said, settling herself back into her chair with deliberate slowness, "I have a very uncomfortable feeling that this matter is not yet concluded. In fact, I suspect it is only just beginning." The sound of the dinner gong echoed through Thornfield Manor at 7:30, a summons that Miss Marple recognized as the signal for the household to gather. She had accepted Lady Ashworth's invitation to stay for dinner, citing the lateness of the hour and the poor condition of the roads as reasons, though in truth her reasons were far more pressing. She needed to observe the household in its natural state, to see how people behaved when they believed themselves to be safe from scrutiny. Before leaving Charlotte's room, Miss Marple had extracted a promise that the girl would say nothing of their conversation to anyone, including her mother. Charlotte had protested weakly, but Miss Marple's gentle insistence had ultimately prevailed. There was a method to this discretion, though Miss Marple could not yet articulate it fully, even to herself. She was waiting for something, some piece of information that would slot into place and transform the scattered puzzle pieces into coherent form. The dining room at Thornfield Manor was an elegant space, all dark wood panelling and ancestral portraits that seemed to regard the modern inhabitants with aristocratic disapproval. Lord Ashworth sat at the head of the table, and Miss Marple was troubled to observe how diminished he appeared. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his wine-glass, and there was a greyish tinge to his complexion that spoke of genuine illness. Lady Ashworth fussed over him solicitously, urging him to eat more, suggesting he retire early. He waved her concerns away with the irritability of a man who was tired of being treated as an invalid. "Dreadful business, that young Merrick showing up today uninvited," Lord Ashworth remarked to no one in particular. "The fellow seems to have no sense of proper boundaries. I'd thought we'd seen the last of him when Charlotte's engagement was broken off." "Mamma invited him," Charlotte said quietly from her seat. "It was on the original guest list." "Well, that was a mistake," Lord Ashworth said curtly. "The man is a nuisance, always hovering about, always looking as though he expects something from us. I've told you before, my dear," he addressed this to his wife, "that we cannot be responsible for every disappointed young man who crosses our path." Miss Marple, who had been attending to her soup with apparent concentration, observed Lord Ashworth's reaction with considerable interest. There was something almost defensive in his tone, something that went beyond mere social annoyance. His fingers had tightened on his spoon, and a faint flush had risen to his cheeks. "Has Mr. Merrick been troublesome, then?" Miss Marple inquired mildly, turning to Lord Ashworth with an expression of polite curiosity. "I confess I know very little about the young man. His father handled some legal matters for my cousin in Hampshire, if I recall correctly, but I've never had occasion to meet the son." "No more troublesome than any disappointed suitor," Lord Ashworth replied, perhaps a fraction too quickly. "It's simply that the fellow hasn't the sense to accept that some things are finished. Charlotte chose to end their engagement, and that should have been an end to the matter. But he continued to press his attentions." Miss Marple's tone suggested mere idle interest, yet her eyes were sharp as flint. "He did, yes. Wrote letters, called at the house, made general nuisances of himself. But I've made it clear that such behavior is unwelcome. I believe he's finally accepted the situation." Lord Ashworth turned his attention back to his soup with what appeared to be firm determination to close the subject. The meal progressed through its various courses with the formal precision of upper-class dining. Between courses, servants cleared plates with practiced efficiency, and conversation turned to safer topics: the approaching flower show, the vicar's plans for the church roof repairs, speculation about whether the Hendersons' eldest son would indeed marry the Collingwood girl. All the comfortable trivia of village life, the small currency that kept social intercourse flowing. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, Miss Marple sensed currents of tension running through the room like underground streams. Charlotte barely ate, merely pushing food about her plate. Lady Ashworth watched her husband with an anxiety that went beyond concern for his health, and Lord Ashworth himself seemed to be employing considerable effort to maintain his composure, though his eye occasionally darted toward the door as though he expected someone to enter. It was as the cheese course was being served that the telephone rang, a startling intrusion into the formal dining room. A footman appeared almost immediately, looking troubled. "Begging your pardon, my lord," he said, "but there's a call from the police station in town. They're asking to speak with you on a matter of some urgency. Shall I have them hold the line?" The effect of this announcement was rather like dropping a stone into a still pond. All conversation ceased. Lord Ashworth's hand froze halfway to his mouth. Lady Ashworth's face went quite pale. And Charlotte had gone absolutely rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. "What on earth?" Lord Ashworth set down his fork with deliberate care. "Tell them I'll take the call in my study. Don't keep them waiting." As he rose and excused himself, Miss Marple continued eating her cheese with serene composure, but her mind was racing. Police calls to the house of an established gentleman were not routine matters. They suggested complications, entanglements, perhaps even accusations. And the reaction of the household. Oh, the reaction had been most illuminating indeed. Within 5 minutes, Lord Ashworth returned, and the expression on his face was one of genuine shock. "There's been an accident," he said, his voice strained. "Young Merrick was found this evening near the Old Mill Road. He's been struck down by a motor car, apparently. The police are saying it may not have been accidental." The silence that followed Lord Ashworth's announcement was absolute and suffocating. Even the servants seemed to have frozen in place, their hands stilled mid-gesture, their carefully maintained professional expressions slipping to reveal shock. Charlotte made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and her mother reached over to grip her hand. "Struck by a motor car," Lady Ashworth repeated faintly. "But surely it was simply an accident. The young man may have been walking in the road, or perhaps the driver didn't see him in the dimming light." "The police seem to suggest otherwise," Lord Ashworth said, resuming his seat with the deliberate movements of someone moving through a dream. "They were asking about his movements this afternoon, about who had seen him, where he had gone after leaving here. The constable said there were certain circumstances that made them suspicious of the official story." Miss Marple, who had continued her methodical consumption of cheese, now set down her knife with quiet precision. "How dreadful," she said, her voice carrying genuine sympathy. "A young man, barely into his prime. I do hope he wasn't killed outright. Perhaps there's still hope for recovery." "I'm afraid not," Lord Ashworth said grimly. "He was pronounced dead at the scene. The doctor estimates he's been lying there for some hours, since perhaps 5 o'clock or shortly thereafter." Charlotte made another sound, this time distinctly a suppressed cry. She rose abruptly from her chair, mumbling an excuse about feeling unwell, and hurried from the dining room. Lady Ashworth made to follow her, but Lord Ashworth raised a restraining hand. "Leave her be," he said quietly. "She knew the young man once. It's natural she should be upset." But Miss Marple, observing the exchange with her customary attention, noted that his words contradicted his eyes. There was something more than mere social awkwardness in Lord Ashworth's manner now, something that spoke of genuine fear, and the way he had phrased his comment, "She knew the young man once," suggested that he understood far more about the nature of that acquaintance than he had previously let on. The remainder of dinner was conducted in an atmosphere of subdued tension. Conversation became desultory and forced. Lord Ashworth ate little, his fork moving listlessly across his plate. When the meal finally concluded, he excused himself, claiming fatigue and a need to retire early. Lady Ashworth, clearly torn between concern for her husband and anxiety about her daughter, eventually followed him upstairs after ensuring that Miss Marple had everything she required for the night. Miss Marple was shown to the blue guest room on the second floor, a charming space with floral wallpaper and an excellent view of the drive. The housemaid who escorted her up was one of the younger servants, a girl of perhaps 16 with curious eyes that darted about the room as though assessing whether Miss Marple had brought anything worth noting. Miss Marple, recognizing the signs of someone bursting with the desire to gossip, engaged her in conversation with practiced ease. "You must be quite tired after such a full day," Miss Marple remarked, unpacking her night-case with unhurried deliberation. "All those guests to attend to. I do hope there were no difficulties." "Oh no, miss," the girl said eagerly. "Very smooth the party was, though I will say there was a bit of tension when Mr. Merrick arrived. I heard Cook mention it to Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper. She said Lord Ashworth wasn't best pleased to see him, and that there'd been some business between them some years back that wasn't quite settled proper-like." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And did you happen to notice when Mr. Merrick departed?" "Can't say I did particularly, miss. I was in the kitchen most of the afternoon, but I did see him walking toward the drive round about 4 o'clock, looking rather troubled. He had his jacket slung over his arm and seemed to be in a great hurry. Didn't even say goodbye to anyone, just sort of slipped away quiet-like." Miss Marple filed this information away with her customary precision. And I suppose he's well known in the village. His family, I mean. Oh yes, miss. The Merricks have been here for generations, though they've come down in the world quite a bit, if you take my meaning. His father, Mr. Augustus Merrick, he used to be quite prosperous, solicitor and all that, but there was some scandal a few years back. Money went missing from his accounts, though I'm not entirely certain of the details. My mother worked in the Merrick household before I came here, and she said Mr. Augustus was never quite the same after. Took to drink, she said, though that's perhaps just village talk. How dreadful for the family, Miss Marple said sympathetically. And the son? Was he involved in this scandal? Not that anyone knew, miss, but he did seem bitter about it all, or so I've heard. Some people said he blamed folk here in the village for turning against his father, spreading gossip and such. There was talk of him wanting to prove that his father had been wrongly accused, that someone else was responsible for the missing money. Though what good that would do after so many years, I couldn't say. The girl was dismissed soon after, and Miss Marple spent the remainder of the evening in quiet contemplation, seated in the comfortable armchair beside the window with her knitting. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The manor grounds were invisible save where the moonlight touched the drive. She knitted with mechanical precision while her mind assembled the pieces of the puzzle with the care of someone arranging flowers for a particularly important arrangement. By the time the clock on the mantelpiece struck 11, she had arrived at several conclusions, though one remained stubbornly obscure. She knew what had motivated Thomas Merrick's blackmail attempt. She understood the nature of the letters and the old scandal they referenced. She even comprehended with reasonable certainty why Charlotte had been attempting to conceal her bruised wrists. What she did not yet know was who had struck down Thomas Merrick as he walked along the old mill road, and why they had chosen to do so at precisely that moment. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that such answers had a way of revealing themselves to those patient enough to wait. The morning brought with it a grey June drizzle that seemed to match the sombre mood that had settled over Thornfield Manor. Miss Marple descended to breakfast to find the household in a state of considerable disarray. Lord Ashworth, she was informed by Lady Ashworth, had suffered a restless night and was still abed, under strict orders from the doctor not to exert himself. Lady Ashworth herself looked haggard, her carefully arranged hair slightly dishevelled, her hands trembling as she poured tea. "The police inspector from the town has already telephoned twice this morning," Lady Ashworth confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's insisting on coming to interview Lord Ashworth, despite the doctor's express wishes that he not be disturbed. It's all most distressing. I simply cannot imagine why they should need to question my husband about that poor boy's accident. Perhaps they're merely being thorough," Miss Marple suggested gently, accepting a cup of tea. "In cases where there's any question of foul play, the police must investigate all possibilities. It's quite standard procedure." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Miss Marple's mind was working through a more troubling scenario. Inspector Graves, for it was indeed Inspector Graves, a competent man whom Miss Marple had encountered in previous circumstances, would not be making such persistent inquiries unless he had already begun to suspect that Thomas Merrick's death was not the simple accident it had initially appeared to be. The question was what had directed his suspicions, and more importantly, toward whom they had been directed. Charlotte appeared briefly at breakfast, dressed in black as though already in mourning, though she touched virtually nothing that was offered to her. The dark circles beneath her eyes suggested she had passed an equally restless night. She was pale to the point of appearing translucent, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Has anyone said how it happened?" she asked, addressing no one in particular. "I mean, precisely how the motor car struck him." "The police haven't released those details," Lady Ashworth said. "Inspector Graves was rather tight-lipped when he telephoned, but apparently the vehicle didn't stop. Whoever was driving simply left him there. The constable on evening patrol found him nearly an hour later." This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. A hit and run suggested either panic or deliberate intention to conceal the crime. Accident victims were often discovered immediately. Those who had been deliberately struck down were frequently left to chance discovery, which might delay identification and muddle the timeline of events. It was precisely the sort of detail that separated misadventure from premeditation. The telephone rang again at 9:30, and this time the caller was not the police. Instead, a message was brought to Miss Marple that Inspector Graves had arrived at the manor and was requesting her presence in the study. She set down her knitting with equanimity, bid Lady Ashworth to think nothing of it, and made her way downstairs with unhurried grace. Inspector Graves was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and methodical, with the sort of face that gave little away. He rose when Miss Marple entered, greeting her with evident relief. "Miss Marple, I'm grateful you're here," he said. "Lady Ashworth has informed me that you arrived yesterday afternoon and have been staying as a guest. I wonder if you might have observed anything unusual in the household or around the grounds that might prove relevant to my investigation." "That rather depends on what precisely you're investigating, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, settling herself in the chair he offered. "I had understood the matter to be one of a motor-car accident, tragic though it undoubtedly is." Graves exchanged a glance with the constable who had accompanied him, a younger man with an eager expression. "It may not be an accident, Miss Marple. You see, we've had a report from someone claiming to have witnessed the incident. They say the motor car didn't strike Mr. Merrick accidentally. They say it was deliberately driven at him. The witness didn't come forward immediately because they were frightened, but this morning they contacted us. The description they provided was quite specific." "And whose motor car do they claim it was?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's the difficulty," Graves said carefully. "The witness couldn't identify the vehicle with certainty. They said it was a dark-colored sedan, fairly new, moving at considerable speed. What they were certain about was that the driver accelerated directly toward the victim rather than attempting to avoid him. That suggests intentional action rather than accident." "How many dark-colored sedans are there in the village, Inspector?" "At least 6 that we've been able to identify so far. And one of them, well, that's another complication. Lord Ashworth drives a dark Bentley that matches the general description provided by our witness. His chauffeur has confirmed that the vehicle was out yesterday afternoon, though he claims Lord Ashworth took it himself and returned it sometime around 5 o'clock. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind had just taken a significant leap forward. "And where was Lord Ashworth when the motor car struck Mr. Merrick?" "That's precisely what I'm attempting to determine," Graves said. "His wife seems uncertain about his movements yesterday afternoon. She was occupied with the garden party and says she didn't see him for some hours. It's one of the reasons I need to interview him, though apparently his health is rather precarious at the moment." "Indeed it is," Miss Marple confirmed. "Though I wonder, Inspector, whether you might have the wrong suspect entirely. Have you considered that someone else might have been driving Lord Ashworth's motor car? A motor car left unattended at a residence where there are servants and family members is not necessarily being driven by its owner." Graves frowned as though this particular angle had not sufficiently occurred to him. "You're suggesting that someone in this household deliberately struck down Mr. Merrick?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that you should investigate all possibilities before arriving at conclusions. Tell me, did your witness happen to note whether the driver was male or female?" The inspector's hesitation was answer enough. "They couldn't be certain," Graves admitted reluctantly. "The motor car was moving at speed and the light was beginning to fail. They said the driver appeared to be of average build, but whether that indicated a man or woman, they couldn't definitively say. Most witnesses assume masculine when presented with aggression, I've found." Miss Marple nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. "I see. And the letters that Mr. Merrick possessed, have you recovered those from his person or residence?" Graves looked startled. "What letters? We found no correspondence on the body, and his lodgings have been searched. There was nothing of obvious significance. How did you know about letters? I didn't know precisely, Miss Marple said, which was technically true, though her inference had been reasonable given Charlotte's revelations. But I suspected that young Mr. Merrick's presence at the garden party yesterday was connected to some matter of financial or personal consequence. A man doesn't insert himself into social situations uninvited without considerable motivation. And the reaction his arrival provoked suggested matters of some delicacy. The inspector leaned forward slightly. Miss Marple, I have considerable respect for your judgment in these matters. Are you suggesting that Mr. Merrick's death was not a random act of violence, but rather something deliberately planned and executed? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple replied carefully, that premeditation and preparation are distinguishable from sudden rage. If someone deliberately drove a motor car at Mr. Merrick, they must have known he would be on that road at that particular time. That requires either following him or knowing his intentions in advance, or having arranged to meet him there. The casual nature of a garden party seems an unlikely setting for such arrangements to be made. Graves was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desk. Unless the meeting was arranged at the garden party itself, and the victim was leaving to keep that appointment when he was struck down. Precisely, Miss Marple said, which brings us to the question of who would have had both the motive and the opportunity to ensure such a meeting, and the ability to access Lord Ashworth's motor car without his knowledge or consent. Before Graves could respond, there came a sharp knock on the study door. The constable rose to open it, and one of the housemaids appeared, looking flustered and uncertain. "Begging your pardon, Inspector," she said, "but there's been a development. We've found something in the servants' quarters that you should see straight away. It's in Miss Charlotte's room." The color seemed to drain from Inspector Graves' face. He rose with deliberate slowness, his expression hardening into something more official and less sympathetic. "Show me," he commanded, and the constable and housemaid hurried from the study. Graves paused at the threshold, turning back to Miss Marple. "I'd be obliged if you would remain here, Miss Marple. I may have further questions." Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting, though her needles remained idle in her lap as she listened to the sounds of activity in the corridor. She could hear footsteps ascending the stairs, voices raised in urgent conversation, the opening and closing of doors. After what seemed an interminable wait, Graves returned, his expression now grave and troubled. "We've found blood," he said without preamble, "in Miss Charlotte's room, on her undergarments that she had attempted to conceal in the back of her wardrobe. A considerable amount of blood, Miss Marple, and I've just spoken with the doctor who examined Mr. Merrick's body. There were defensive wounds on the victim's hands, suggesting he fought with his attacker. If that blood matches the victim's type, and in a village of this size, the chances are significant. Then I have a very difficult conversation ahead of me with Lord and Lady Ashworth." "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "And you believe that Charlotte was in the motor car with Mr. Merrick when it struck him?" "I believe," Graves said carefully, "that the evidence suggests Miss Charlotte had a physical altercation with Mr. Merrick at some point yesterday evening. Whether that altercation occurred in the motor car or elsewhere remains to be determined. But I must now question her directly about her movements and activities during the critical hours." "Before you do so, Inspector," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting with deliberate care, "I wonder if I might be permitted to speak with her first. Not to coach her or conceal evidence, you understand, but simply to ensure she understands the gravity of her situation. There are aspects of her circumstances that I believe would be better understood with context, and I suspect she may be more forthcoming with me than with an official representative of the law." Graves hesitated, clearly torn between procedure and pragmatism. "5 minutes, Miss Marple. No more, and I'll have the constable positioned outside the door to ensure nothing is concealed or destroyed." Charlotte was discovered in her room, sitting on the edge of her bed with a completely blank expression, as though she had removed herself entirely from the moment. When Miss Marple entered, she looked up with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of anything other than condemnation. They found the blood, didn't they? Charlotte said flatly. I wondered how long it would take. I tried to clean it, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't manage properly. I should have burned the garments, but I couldn't. I couldn't seem to make myself do it. Tell me precisely what happened, Miss Marple said, settling herself beside the young woman. Tell me everything, from the moment Mr. Merrick left the garden party until the police arrived. Charlotte's hands twisted together in her lap as she began to speak, her voice so quiet that Miss Marple had to lean forward to hear her clearly. The girl's composure had shattered entirely, leaving behind only raw confession and the desperate need to unburden herself of secrets that had become intolerable weights. After I spoke with Thomas in the garden, Charlotte began, I was absolutely terrified. I kept thinking about what he'd said, about destroying the letters, about leaving the village. Part of me wanted to believe him, to think that everything might simply resolve itself if I just agreed to forgive him. But another part of me, a part that I'm ashamed of now, was furious. He had no right to come here, to blackmail my father, to grab me and hurt me. And despite what he said about wanting to leave, I didn't trust him. I thought he might change his mind again, that he would return with new demands. So you decided to meet with him again? Miss Marple prompted gently. Yes. I sent him a note through one of the garden party servants, asking him to meet me at 5 o'clock on the Old Mill Road. I told him I decided to help him, that I wanted to discuss the arrangement privately, away from the house. I thought if I could get him to understand how serious the situation was, how much damage his blackmail could do, perhaps I could convince him to truly let the matter drop. Or perhaps, Charlotte trailed off, her face flushing with shame, or perhaps you had another intention, Miss Marple suggested, her voice remaining neutral. I told myself I was going to reason with him, Charlotte whispered. But deep down, I think I wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt me. I wanted him to feel the same fear and helplessness I'd been feeling since he grabbed my wrists in the copse. So I took Father's motor car. I knew he was resting, and the chauffeur had been given the afternoon off. I thought I would simply take it for a few minutes, meet Thomas, and return it before anyone noticed. And what occurred when you met Mr. Merrick on the mill road? Charlotte's entire body began to tremble. He was waiting for me, standing in the middle of the road as though he owned it. When he saw the motor car approaching, he waved at me, as though we were friends meeting for tea. I brought the car to a stop and got out. I told him we needed to talk, that I'd been thinking about his proposal. He seemed pleased, relieved even. He said he was grateful, that he knew I would understand eventually. But you didn't intend to help him, Miss Marple said quietly. No, Charlotte admitted. As soon as I saw him standing there, all the fear and anger came rushing back. I thought about my father, about how this man was destroying him with his threats and his letters. I thought about the bruises on my wrists, about the way he'd grabbed me with such casual violence. And I thought that if he were simply gone, if he truly did leave the village as he'd promised, everything might be resolved. I might even have believed that at that moment. I might have convinced myself that I was acting in defense of my family. What did you do, Charlotte? I got back into the motor car, Charlotte said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Thomas was confused at first. He asked me what I was doing. I told him to get in, that we should drive somewhere more private to discuss matters. He hesitated, but then he did as I asked. He climbed into the passenger seat. And then she stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone accustomed to the silence that surrounded terrible truths. I drove, Charlotte finally continued. We were talking, and he was explaining his plans for London, how he would start fresh there. He seemed almost happy, Miss Marple. He seemed like the Thomas I had known before everything became so complicated. And I genuinely thought, that perhaps we could find a way to resolve this that didn't require him to remain in the village. That perhaps if he truly did leave, everyone could move past this. But something changed, Miss Marple observed. He saw something, Charlotte said. In the glove compartment of the motor car, there was a letter. One of the letters he had written to my father. I must have left it there by accident when I was looking through them in the car. Thomas saw it, and he picked it up before I could stop him. He read it, and his entire demeanor changed. He became angry, accusatory. He said I had betrayed him, that I had no intention of helping him at all. He said I'd lured him into the motor car to do something terrible to him. Charlotte's voice broke entirely now, tears streaming down her face. He tried to get out of the motor car. We were moving slowly, not very fast at all, and he reached for the door handle. I panicked. I thought he was going to run, to go to the police, to tell them everything. So I accelerated. I didn't intend to. I didn't mean to actually hit him with the motor car. I just wanted him to get back in, to stay in the car so I could think, so I could figure out what to do. "But you did hit him," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "Yes," Charlotte sobbed. "He fell, and I saw him in the mirror, lying on the road behind me. I stopped the car immediately and got out to help him. There was blood everywhere. He was conscious, but he was hurt, badly hurt. And then he looked at me with such confusion and such betrayal, and he said my name. He said, 'Charlotte, why?' And I panicked. I got back into the motor car and drove home. I left him there on the road like he was nothing, like he was just an obstacle to be removed." The confession hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Outside, the rain continued its grey patter against the windows, and somewhere in the house, Inspector Graves waited to hear what Miss Marple had learned. Miss Marple rose from her seat with deliberate slowness, her aged frame requiring a moment to straighten fully. She moved to the window and gazed out at the rain-soaked garden, her expression thoughtful and composed, though her mind was working with considerable intensity. When she turned back to face Charlotte, her eyes held a complexity of emotion that the younger woman could not quite parse. Compassion warred with something else, something closer to concern. "Charlotte," Miss Marple said quietly, "I must ask you a question, and I require you to answer with absolute honesty. When you saw Thomas lying on the road behind you, when you looked in the mirror and observed his injuries, how serious did they appear to be? Did you believe, in that moment, that he was dying?" Charlotte's sobs had subsided into shaking silence. She looked up at Miss Marple with red-rimmed eyes. I think he might have been unconscious. There was so much blood. I thought he might be dead or close to it. But I was so frightened, so certain that if I stopped, if I helped him, everything would unravel. So I drove home as fast as I dared, parked the motor car where it belonged, and came inside. No one saw me. The chauffeur was still away, and Father was resting. I came directly to my room and tried to clean the blood from my clothes. "And you have remained in your room since that time," Miss Marple said, "with the exception of appearing at dinner and attending the garden party this morning?" "Yes," Charlotte whispered. "I kept thinking someone would come, that someone would have discovered what I'd done. But no one did. Not until this morning when the police arrived with their questions." Miss Marple returned to her seat with measured grace. "My dear, I must tell you something that will be both reassuring and troubling in equal measure. Thomas Merrick was not killed by the impact of the motor car. The police inspector informed me that the constable who discovered him found him still living, though gravely injured. It was internal bleeding that ultimately proved fatal, and that bleeding occurred some hours after the incident. You did not, in fact, commit murder." Charlotte's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible. But that means he was lying there in pain, suffering, and I simply left him. I could have saved him if I had stayed, if I had called for help. I killed him just as surely as if I had— "You did not kill him," Miss Marple interrupted gently but firmly. "You caused him injury through recklessness and panic, but death is a different matter entirely. However, the law will not make such fine distinctions. You will be charged with dangerous driving at the very least, and quite possibly with manslaughter or assault causing grievous bodily harm. Those are serious matters, Charlotte, and they require serious consideration." "I know," Charlotte said dully. "I deserve to be punished. I've known that since the moment I drove away and left him there. Part of me is almost relieved that it's over, that I don't have to carry this secret anymore." There came a knock at the door, and Miss Marple rose to open it. Inspector Graves stood in the corridor, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the constable waited with the grim patience of someone accustomed to the worst aspects of human nature. "Well?" Graves asked quietly. "Miss Charlotte has something she wishes to tell you, Inspector," Miss Marple said. "I believe she is now prepared to give you a full and honest account of her movements yesterday afternoon. However, I would strongly suggest that she be allowed to contact a solicitor before making any formal statement. Given the circumstances and the complexity of the situation, she would benefit from legal counsel." Graves nodded slowly, his eyes moving from Miss Marple to Charlotte and back again. "Very well. Miss Charlotte, you'll need to come with me to the station for a formal interview. Constable, please escort her downstairs and ensure she has an opportunity to inform her parents of the situation." As the constable moved into the room and gently took Charlotte's arm, Miss Marple placed a restraining hand on the inspector's sleeve. "A word, if you please, Inspector, before you proceed with your questioning." They stepped into the corridor, and Graves pulled the door closed behind them. His expression was weary, tinged with the particular exhaustion that came from confronting human weakness and moral failure. "There is something you should know," Miss Marple said, keeping her voice low. "The letters that young Mr. Merrick was using for blackmail purposes. They relate to events that occurred some years ago. Specifically, a matter of missing funds from a legal trust. I believe you will find that those funds did not go missing through any action of Lord Ashworth's. Rather, I suspect they were misappropriated by someone within his household or circle of trust, and Lord Ashworth has been protecting that individual." "Do you know who?" Graves asked sharply. "I have a considerable suspicion," Miss Marple replied. "But suspicion is not proof, and I would not care to direct your investigation down an avenue that might prove incorrect. However, I would suggest that you examine the financial records of the Ashworth household from approximately 5 years ago, with particular attention to any irregularities or discrepancies. You may find that your investigation into young Mr. Merrick's death has inadvertently uncovered a far older crime." Graves was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "You're suggesting that Lord Ashworth may have known more about this situation than he's admitted?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that family loyalty is a powerful thing, Inspector, and that sometimes people do extraordinary things to protect those they love. Charlotte's actions yesterday were wrong, but they were actions born of fear and desperate desire to defend her family from what she perceived as a threat. She is young, and youth often mistakes panic for necessity." "That doesn't excuse what she's done," Graves said firmly. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It does not excuse it, but it may explain it, and in the law, explanation sometimes matters as much as guilt or innocence." The interrogation of Charlotte Ashworth consumed the remainder of the day and into the evening. Miss Marple, having provided her account of the young woman's confession to Inspector Graves, found herself in the peculiar position of being neither witness nor suspect, yet somehow central to the unfolding investigation. She occupied herself in the drawing room with her knitting, listening to the muted sounds of police activity throughout the manor. Doors opening and closing, hushed conversations in hallways, the methodical collection of evidence. It was not until nearly 9 o'clock that evening that Graves returned to seek her counsel once more. He looked considerably more troubled than he had that morning, as though the day's revelations had added layers of complexity to what had initially seemed a straightforward case of dangerous driving. "I've taken Miss Charlotte's formal statement," he said, settling himself into the chair across from Miss Marple. "She's admitted to the incident with the motor car, though her solicitor has counseled her to maintain that it was accidental, that she swerved to avoid hitting something and unfortunately struck Mr. Merrick. It's a delicate distinction, but one that might make considerable difference in how a magistrate views the matter. And Mr. Merrick, Miss Marple inquired, has there been any further information regarding the nature of his injuries? The doctor has completed his examination, Graves confirmed. The injuries sustained from the motor car impact were serious, but not necessarily fatal on their own. However, he had internal bleeding that continued for several hours before he was discovered. Had he received medical attention within the first hour or two, he likely would have survived. The delay proved fatal. Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful precision. Inspector, I wonder if you have had the opportunity to examine those financial records I mentioned earlier. The matter of the missing funds from Lord Ashworth's legal trust. Graves nodded slowly. That's precisely why I've come to speak with you again. I've been reviewing records from 5 years ago, and I've found something rather extraordinary. The missing funds, approximately £800, a considerable sum at the time, were indeed withdrawn from the trust account. However, they were withdrawn by someone with authorized access to the accounts. Someone whose signature appears on numerous legitimate transactions for the Ashworth household. The chauffeur, Miss Marple suggested gently. The former chauffeur, yes, a man named Edward Collis, who worked for the Ashworths for nearly 20 years before leaving quite suddenly some 5 years ago. According to the household staff, he departed without notice and without providing a forwarding address. Lord Ashworth told everyone at the time that Collis had taken another position abroad, but the financial records tell a different story entirely. Lord Ashworth paid him off, Miss Marple said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. It appears so, Graves confirmed. There are records of regular payments made to an account in Edward Collis's name for approximately 2 years following his departure. The payments eventually ceased, and there is no further record of the man. It's as though he disappeared entirely. But here is what troubles me, Miss Marple. Thomas Merrick somehow obtained knowledge of this transaction. His letters to Lord Ashworth reference it explicitly, using language that suggests he had documentary evidence. And yet we've found no such evidence among his possessions. Because he showed it to Charlotte, Miss Marple said, or rather, he threatened to show it to her. When Charlotte discovered that letter in the motorcar's glove compartment, the one that Thomas had left there at some point, she understood that he possessed genuine proof of her father's involvement in concealing the theft. That must have been what precipitated her panic, what caused her to accelerate the motorcar. Graves leaned back in his chair, his expression weary. So the question becomes, where is this documentary evidence now? If Thomas Merrick had proof, where would he have kept it? Has anyone searched his lodgings thoroughly? Miss Marple asked. Not merely for obvious items, but for hiding places. Young men who are being blackmailed often keep their evidence in locations where it will be discovered only if something happens to them. It's a form of insurance. We searched his rooms, but admittedly, not with the expectation that there might be hidden compartments or concealed locations. I'll have the constables return in the morning with fresh eyes and renewed attention to detail. But Miss Marple, I must ask you directly, did you know about Lord Ashworth's involvement in this matter before you spoke with Charlotte? Did you suspect him from the beginning? Miss Marple considered the question with her customary thoughtfulness. I suspected that Lord Ashworth possessed knowledge of something that caused him considerable anxiety. The mention of Mr. Merrick seemed to provoke in him a reaction that went beyond mere social awkwardness. And when the servant girl mentioned the old scandals surrounding the Merrick family, the missing funds from their legal accounts, it occurred to me that such scandals often have a peculiar way of repeating themselves. People who have witnessed one instance of embezzlement are sometimes susceptible to becoming victims of blackmail by those who have discovered their own indiscretions. But you didn't know for certain, Graves pressed. No, Miss Marple admitted. I had suspicions, and I had patterns that seemed to fit. But certainty is a luxury that comes only after all the evidence has been examined. What I did know with reasonable certainty was that Charlotte was not the primary actor in this drama. She was a secondary player, reacting to circumstances that had been set in motion long before yesterday's garden party. The gloves, the bruises, her visible distress, these were all responses to pressure rather than indications of premeditation on her part. So you believe her account? That the striking of Mr. Merrick was accidental, born of panic rather than intention? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that Charlotte's actions were born of fear and confusion, and that she made a catastrophic error in judgment. Whether that constitutes an accident in the legal sense is not for me to determine. But I do believe that the true villain in this drama is not Charlotte, but rather a young man who allowed desperation to overcome his better nature, and an older man who allowed guilt and family loyalty to compromise his integrity. Charlotte is merely the tragic consequence of those failures. The rain had ceased by the time Miss Marple retired to her room that night. The June sky had cleared to reveal a stunning array of stars, and the garden below Thornfield Manor was bathed in soft moonlight. She stood at the window for a long moment, contemplating the nature of human weakness and the complicated ways in which guilt, loyalty, and fear intertwine to create circumstances of genuine tragedy. Somewhere in that quiet village, a young man lay dead because of decisions made by others. And somewhere else, a young woman faced the consequences of attempting to protect her family from truths they could not bear. Such was the world, Miss Marple reflected, in which people lived and died and struggled with the weight of their own choices, and such were the mysteries that required patient observation and deep understanding of human nature to unravel. Tomorrow would bring new revelations and perhaps some measure of justice. But tonight, Miss Marple simply knitted and waited for whatever came next. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective style.